And then we decided to extend this conversation that started there and create these online webinars as a meeting place, as meeting points for thinkers and specialists on the subject, in order to collect good ideas and thoughts that cover this really big and generic issue that is about identity. Because I presume you would agree that identity is not about only developing technologies, is about policy making, is about economy, and eventually is about democracy. And this holistic overview, this holistic concept, we would like to explore today with our kind speakers who were kind enough to join us on the 30th of July, and of course our audience this late afternoon for the European zone. Josh is on the other continent, is our only guest from Canada. So we thank you for joining us, is Josh, Lorna, and Joshua, our guest speakers. And with no further ado, I would like to give the floor to Rob, who will welcome our guests and have his introductory questions. And of course, I would like to encourage all the participants to join the conversation by adding their questions on the specific column that is on the right of their screen. So I will go mute it right now and join you later on. And thank you once again. Looking forward to listen to your thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mantalena, for this very good and timely introduction that is showing the scope of what we are trying to do, and the fact that this series of webinars is part of that. So like you, I also want to be short because it's about our guests. And so I would like to start with Josh Crumb from Abaxx.Tech. And well, Josh, the floor is yours.
There we go. Thank you, and thank you for having me here. I would say I'm probably one of the more unlikely guests on such an esteemed panel, sitting in Canada as a mining engineer. But I guess I really consider myself a recovering entrepreneur who's been involved in starting businesses in a number of places after I was an economist at Goldman Sachs. I've started businesses in financial technology, where I guess I very much came in close contact with new engineering systems in know your customer protocols for onboarding new customers around the world. And saw the real challenges and a lot of frictions in that. What Abaxx Technologies is doing at this time, our actual core business, again, is actually not in the identity ecosystem, but we realize that identity and digital identity is probably one of the most important new technologies. And decentralized digital identity is one of the most important new technologies, and really is at the intersection of both many of the major problems we're having in social media, as well as in the areas of financial inclusion, and really, identity is such an important issue in so many realms. But the core of our business is actually we're building a new energy futures exchange, a new commodity futures exchange in Singapore, focused on the energy transition from predominantly coal and oil and hydrocarbon based economies to transition fuels like clean natural gas and eventually more and more renewables. So our core business is actually in the exchange of energy. However, what we've decided as a design feature very early in our business is that we want to help advance the decentralized identity technical protocols. And really have new systems of digital identity be core to our entire way that our customers and our support staff and everybody interacts with our exchange. One thing that we've found, I think there's been some very interesting projects over the last 2 or 3 years that are really emerging in new internet identity architectures. But the problem is they have not been able to displace, the major, I guess, what I think is identity network oligopolies or monopolies in Google and Facebook, and really these major tech companies are really identity networks at the core of their business. And so with all these new initiatives happening both in the private sector, in decentralized identity, as well as in public sectors in new policies around digital identity and data rights and privacy, there's a lot of great momentum, but we have these huge internet behemoths that really are identity networks, sort of stifling a lot of the innovation in our view. So I've taken a very different strategy in that, first of all, our business is not about identity. It's actually about energy exchange, but we will become a hub and a network to start introducing new identity systems in the world. So I suppose, again, this is a very roundabout path. I guess as a creative entrepreneur, I guess it's the only path I know is to try to think outside the box to advance very important issues. So I'll leave it for there and encourage more of a discussion as we get deeper into it.
Yeah, thank you very much, Josh. And that's exactly this is exactly one of the things that we are trying to unearth as you're speaking now, is that this topic of identity is sort of horizontal, and it's sort of unearthed in a lot of different discussions. But you're coming from a perspective of entrepreneurship and a perspective of not trying to tackle identity as such, but trying to tackle a real business problem. So for us, that's extremely interesting and important, because it shows that it's indeed about new business models that we are about, and it's not a theoretical discussion that we're sort of having. These are real deep and important issues that need to be solved on the ground. And having you working there, that's exactly what we are interested in. So I think if it's okay with you, we go to Lorna and then Joshua, and then sort of start this discussion. Is that okay?
Great. Yeah. Thanks, Rob. Yeah, just a little bit of sort of intro, I think, from my perspective. I was actually also going to open with that I feel like I'm an odd one out in this group, because I'm coming particularly from the user experience and design perspective, but also with a role in bridging between the real world, I call it, and the technology world. And my background from, for the last couple of decades, actually, I think now very much actively involved in IoT, and in the early 2000s was involved in smart city developments, and they're also promoting the development of this technology into our world from an experience design perspective. And I think that's where my sort of first connection with identity and digital identity, and in a much broader sense, started to really develop and evolve. Also understanding that this identity is very much connected to the context and changes in relation to context. And so the data and the technology perspective I saw that was emerging seemed almost to be very much tied to the binary. If we see now, even in the physical world, we have our passport, we have our identity cards, we have one assigned identity. But when you're working in sort of smart developments where people's activities and interactions are involved, then you realize that the identities are changing, and identities need to be actually dynamic. And more recently, funnily enough, in connection with the Corona crisis, started in March with a very dynamic group of technology experts, cryptographic experts, identity experts, and user experience designers in looking at how we could develop an SDK foundation for future potential Corona apps. So actually it's been quite a roller coaster, and this is actually, everybody's been working in the background on top of their professional sort of lives. So it's kind of a non-profit initiative to very fast track the foundation that might actually help support in Corona app development. Being able to feed into this also was the background pre-GDPR, also working for a large telco organization developing a privacy platform. And I noticed one of the things that came out from there, we did a lot of comprehensive research, and it was very interesting to also understand from the user's perspective how they experience privacy and how they also understand the relationship between their identity, the data and information and services, and how far people are prepared to go in order to give access to their information in order to receive services in return. And we see that there's also a lot of variation in understanding, and I think the discussions we've had, Rob, we see that the way that organizations have been assuming that people don't care about their data is actually, in retrospect, potentially damaging future business. Because when you damage people's trust in an organization and trust in an infrastructure, they will actually be more reticent in providing data. And the research, we did quite comprehensive research across Europe, I have to say, not international, indicated that people are actually very open to sharing very, very personal private data if the organization or individuals they're sharing it with are actually trusted, transparent, and also providing in turn services. Different to how we're seeing that at the moment, where identity is actually being sort of taken, used, and abused. Moving then to the identity elements that we've been working on the last few months, here I see a wonderful challenge, similar to the smart city challenges, is that this mismatch between technology development giving us wonderful tools, but somehow not being able to bridge to the unbelievably messy, very difficult to understand reality of the user's world. That is a challenge that I think, well, we're digging deep into that with our sort of UX team at the moment, and it's amazing how every little wonderful piece of technology that we think is actually going to give us a very private or secure alternative to the current situation, when you bring that into the user's world, it actually creates huge problems, even just from the point of view of decentralized recovery. That's we're having just came out of a discussion this afternoon on that. You know, from the technical point of view, it's very, very clear cut. We've got very, very secure options. But when we try and bring that and compete with, for example, I send an email, within 30 seconds, I have a recovery. How can I compete with this centralized version when I actually have to have 24 passcode word that I have to write down or I have to share with somebody else in order to retrieve my data? And that is actually then connected to my identity. So this is, the position where I'm sort of super excited about the developments. We have amazing technology, but if we don't engage more social science perspective, more user experience perspective, we are really not going to bridge that gap between the technology and the real user's world. I think I'll close that there for now, and looking forward to the discussion on this topic.
Thank you, Lorna. I think that's incredibly rich and very timely. And so I think, because it also has to do with this notion of self-sovereign identity and the fact that people are not educated into handling or losing their private keys in that respect and things like that. So we need custodians. And this is exactly also where you've been working on these custodian frameworks that we have, centralization and decentralization, because it's both are really, they're not the extremes that will sort of work. And so I'm extremely happy that we have Joshua Elliott, who is in Malta with the Malta Innovation Authority and the DLT director, and he's actually, I think, one of the first to have put these questions in an academic and a research context, and he's trying to set up frameworks about this as we speak. So maybe, Joshua, I think this would be a very good moment for you to chip in.
Yep, definitely. So I wear two hats. One is as an academic at the Center for DLT at the University of Malta, and I'm mainly interested in blockchain and IoT. And we set up a multidisciplinary master's in blockchain. And the idea is because blockchain is just not about only technology, and education is a very important part. If we eventually want people to start using these systems, we need to educate people in regards to what these systems actually mean to them. And then I wear a second hat as the chairperson of the Malta Digital Innovation Authority, which is a bit of a unique institution. So I would summarize it by saying we are a technology regulator, but that's very controversial. And I'll explain why we are not exactly a regulator, because we don't want to stifle technology. But in regards to self-sovereign digital identity, we were involved at the university in a voting process, allowing for our students to undertake a vote for their particular student reps. And we're also talking to various councils to implement a voting process. And we're starting to know that one of the biggest problems we're having is the onboarding process. How do we know that this individual is the person who they say that they are? And sure, we could have a council on board them, but then aren't we back to a centralized system? Are we back to a centralized authority that we need to trust? And I think one of the main things that we need to start being aware of is that centralization is not necessarily bad, even though in this space, everyone is saying decentralize everything. I think we now need to start thinking about which points of centralization are perfectly fine and acceptable, and which points of centralization need to be removed from the equation. And we need to now start seeing decentralization and centralization work together. So if we want to onboard users to the system, they need to know what it's about. What is in it for them? Why should they move over to a self-sovereign system? And like was already mentioned, what are the perils of the system? What if I lose my keys? What if my custodian loses my keys? So more than anything, I'm just going to keep raising a lot of questions, hopefully to entice more discussion. And if my identity is required to work, let's say, in a Maltese system, and it's also required to work in, say, a system in Greece and various systems around the world, will that actually work? Or do I need different IDs for different types of systems? Which then brings issues of interoperability. How are they going to interact? Do we need one global identity system at the end of the day? And if we do not, does this raise issues to do with different systems interacting together? Can another system perhaps incite negative reputation if it doesn't work properly on the general system in whole? So this raises issues of trust. Who do we trust? When it comes to my identity, it would be great if there was a central authority that we have right now, like our identity authority. We say, if I lose my identity, that authority can prove who I am based upon some database or some passport or something and issue a new identity. We do not have that privilege in a completely decentralized system. Who are we going to trust? Should we trust based upon kinship or perhaps based upon reputation? I mean, this whole space is just raising a lot of questions that require deep thought into the system. And then if we're talking about interoperability, when we're talking about the different types of systems and the technology that we're using, we need to make sure that that technology is working correctly. Especially in the decentralized world, if technology is not implemented correctly, then potentially that mistake cannot be fixed forever. And if we look at traditional software development, we have loads of ways of testing and applying static verification and runtime verification. But in this world, it might not be good enough because a mistake might be, we might be unable to correct that mistake. So we need to start thinking about other means of assurances. And this is really where the framework behind what we do at the Innovation Authority came out. And the idea is that we have independent system auditors look at the technology before it's being deployed, and they come to the opinion that indeed the technology implemented matches the specification. Now, yes, again, that is a centralized authority, and we have to trust that centralized authority. And again, it's not going to be fail-safe, but it's another level of assurance that will help ensure that the technology is correctly implemented. And this then brings me to the next question. So if we're talking about let's say cameras and IoT devices and AI in general and all sorts of different technology that we're using, many nowadays, especially in the AI sphere, are talking about ethical frameworks and legal frameworks for AI. And it's receiving quite a lot of attention. And I think it's actually the wrong direction. We should not be regulating technology, but we should be regulating the activities and the processes. So for example, if we're talking about a camera, would we regulate how we can use a camera? What happens if new technology comes out? So on the camera, would we say you cannot use a camera which has any personal data in it, and you need to make sure that you're not spying using a camera? No, because with all new technology, we would need to implement new laws. So what we do is we typically implement law and regulation on the activity. So we implement data protection law and espionage laws. So in the very same manner, we should avoid this on other technology. We should avoid creating laws to say how we use AI, because at the end of the day, AI is just other type of software. So we should be creating laws, because one of the most often cited examples is that of insurance and bias, that you shouldn't have any bias in when you're issuing insurance claims, rightly so. But you shouldn't regulate AI. You should regulate the insurance policy that is giving out those claims, because surely enough, behind the table, us humans can look at statistics ourselves and give or not give an insurance claim based upon those statistics. So I think this is a point that EU really needs to start taking in consideration, because technology just does what it's programmed to do. And we need to regulate the activity and the human behind it. And technology is going to evolve. So we don't want to have to change our laws every time because new technology comes out. So I would say those are the main angles that I'm looking at from digital identity and the whole decentralized IoT, blockchain, AI space in general.
Well, thank you, Joshua. And I think that's this. These aspects that you talk about is exactly how we want to frame the whole debate, and especially if we want to talk about policy and let's say about European Commission type of thinking about a 500 million zone for Europe. And so basically the repercussions of what you say is that we've created a kind of a hybrid world, which is no longer analog or digital in the sense that we can point out digital objects, but we've created a kind of world, especially with IoT, in which basically the entire environment resonates. So this means that instead of trying to look at isolated or fragmented architectures or protocols, we have to really look at the whole picture, which of course is something that is currently being more effectively, with all its own repercussions, done in Asian countries or in places like China, where you actually have and control this entire, or control to a certain extent, this entire bubble. And of course, going then from centralization to decentralization makes much more sense, and it's also easier in a sense of going from decentralization or fragmentation, which we have to face, to a kind of centralization, in order then to have policymakers understand that the moment that they've actually done this, they should let go, which of course is a tremendous challenge. And that's the kind of challenge, of course, that you face in your education. So can you maybe tell us a little bit about the challenges that you face in educating people into these new roles, I would say, in policy making, that actually maybe also require new skills or new expertise or a whole new set of thinking?
That's right. So when we were helping out with the legislation in Malta, it was a few techies, lawyers, and business professionals. We quickly learned that we don't have the same vocabulary, we don't have the same mindset, and we don't have the same perspective. And this is why it's very important that not only do we need to bridge the gap by trying to understand the other professions, but we need to work all together, understanding that we do have these different perspectives in aim of coming out with a single vision at the end. And I think this might be a potential problem that several jurisdictions have seen, because I don't feel that some jurisdictions have reached out to the techie people, and it was mainly non-techies who have an idea about the technology writing laws for the technology. And I think that is a very slippery slope. And at the same time, then you have the techies on the other side saying, we don't need legislation. Blockchain is self-regulating. Yeah, but blockchain lives in a real world where we need relationships between people, and we need to regulate those relationships. So I think education is at the core of it. And the easiest way to educate about the technology that we found is do not even talk about the technology. The technology, how it works on the inside is not important. What does the technology enable? So in the same way that we do not care about, or most people do not care that email works on SMTP and TCP, IP and all that, most people don't need to care about the fact that blockchain works by consensus amongst different nodes that are mining, creating blocks. So that is the point that I really see that we need to start. We need to start educating our policymakers to understand also their limitations and where they should get in advice from other experts in the various areas.
Thank you. I see we have some questions in the chat, and I will go there soon, but maybe I saw Lorna really sort of picking up on the education part and also on the relationship between the technological expertise and the user. So Lorna, maybe you want to...
Yes, and I'm just wondering, actually, is it possible to screen share? I'm not familiar with this platform, because I think it's also in connection with what you were saying about this. We had this discussion on centralized and decentralized, and I'm just sort of picking up on the question there by Geert on having your friends and relatives. Can I screen share, or is that not?
I think we have to ask.
If you press actions, you have
actions. Okay. What I want to do is just share. It's actually a sketchboard, Miro board that our team who are working on this SDK for disposable identities is our working board. Also to add that the whole team that we're working on, we're doing everything open source because we really believe that if we can actually get this out into the real world, then we're contributing. So we're able to share now. Screen sharing. Oh yes. Okay. Oh, then I have the whole screen sharing. My lovely, I have to give Google access. Dear, I hate when I'm forced to do these things. No, okay, that won't work because I have to give Google access, which I don't have, and then I have to quit. So I will not have the visuals. But actually, what we did is we realized with the technology, and I love it when you saw the techies in the language. We realized we have these meetings which go on longer than we planned because we have this language mismatch and this sort of mismatch of understanding of what we're trying to achieve. So, for example, with decentralized, centralized, from the UX point of view, we realized, well, actually, it's not an either or. We actually have different degrees depending on the context. We're actually working on a decentralized SDK and decentralized context, but we realized that from the technology, that our techies, they were like, we want the most absolutely secure method of sharing data and identity. And we came back and said, well, why? Well, that's because that's what we're aiming for. I said, well, actually, and I think, coming back to I love the question from Geert, who's saying, well, as a user, I actually trust people. Yet in the technology world, people are the most insecure part of my system. But the trust is a very, very important part. And I'm going to trust my partner, my parent, my colleague, more than I am going to trust an anonymous organization, more than I might trust Facebook or Google or even my employer or the government. If I trust these people, technically they're super insecure, but I might want to indeed share my recovery key. So there's actually a cryptographic method we're doing this. We're looking into that. I would share that with them, and then I need to recover. I say, hey, can you give me back all the bits of my code so that I can recover my decentralized system? Because I can no longer send that email to the organization because it's not centralized. But again, then we have the challenge of, well, okay, I can do that technically, I can do that conceptually, but still, how frustrating is that going to be when I want access to a service and I now have to maybe have my time boxed window of 24 hours before I'm able to recover? But then we had the discussion, well, how long does it take to recover your passport when you've lost it? Oh yeah, that can actually take up to a couple of weeks. So maybe users will accept it. But what if you also build in different degrees of sort of identity access? So I go to the retail store, I can still do everything I need with my points in my system because it's not really vulnerable data. But when it gets deeper into a system where I have maybe my health data, my location data, that one I'm going to have to wait for recovery. So huge amounts of questions that relate to my identity, my data, and the context. Technically, it's all possible, but will it actually be usable? And if it's not usable, forget it. People just will not do it. They won't move from the current paradigm.
So you're proposing kind of a notion of custodianship that consists of different layers and different aspects, like having a a really close aspect of friends, having maybe a technical aspect, and maybe some kind of a, because for example, in Holland, I'm always thinking about these organizations that are quite boring, like the automobile driver group that has about 8 million members in Holland, sort of like
the ANWB, yes.
The ANWB, and nobody's really looking at those. But I think every country has these kinds of sort of organizations that seem to be a little bit in the back end. They're very boring, but extremely trustworthy. People trust them, but they're not. So combinations of those, I would say.
Yes. And I think maybe just adding one final part, which is the part that I'm most excited about, the most recent developments, is this concept of the disposable identity. And again, I've evolved my understanding of identity to be identity and data. So it's always context related, but to be able to have this conversation, this identity and data conversation, and then for that to only be relevant in a particular time windowed context. I only need to give you my age, my address, my location to actually receive this particular relevant conversation. When that conversation is finished, it could be after a day, it could be after a year, then I can cut that link to that identity and data. And I think, for me, it really hit home when GDPR kicked in. I mean, everybody had this. You had how many emails of all these companies saying, we believe in holding your privacy, your data secure. Would you please give us permission? I mean, how many of those emails did you get from an organization who said, I don't even know who you are. I don't know how you got my email. But imagine now with the disposable identity that you will be able to see all of the organizations that and people that you've conversed with your identity and data. And you can say, cut 75% of them. And again, going back to the users, well, actually, what are we going to get from that? We might actually see a complete reduction in spam. It's a minor thing maybe compared to, privacy incursions, but still it's like, from a user perspective, that could be amazing.
Because you're talking about context and context and specific, I think I'd like to go and ask Josh to look into this question of Iskander. Because Iskander, and it seems to me that you're also addressing this specifically. So will identity, this is Iskander asking, will identity be the same as it is now, or is it connected to a person, or more to the representation of a person at a certain moment in a certain situation? And how does that influence validation and trust processes? It's two difficult things here, but maybe you'd like to pick up on them.
Yeah, absolutely. It's such a challenging issue. I mean, clearly the core of this whole discussion and this whole idea of communication and identity is about trust, right? And if you look at various business models, the business model is also about trust. Yet we know from distributed and decentralized systems that the most secure and the most, I'll probably throw out a bunch of Nassim Taleb words, but the most anti-fragile system is the system actually where you assume that there's no trust. All right, so we actually want to try to build trustless systems from a architectural or an engineering standpoint, but at the same time, our business models are geared towards building positive trust. Right. So if you even look at the rise of Google and Facebook and these companies, what they did at first was they built their whole network around providing very centralized services that would provide a lot of utility, and just more and more got people to trust them and build this trust and build this trust and build this trust. But the problem is, as their growth of their network, really, hit this tipping point where they've already sort of acquired almost every user in the world, then the business model shifts to harvesting that trust, and it shifts to actually trying to create economic rents out of the trust that they had previously planted and built. And this is going to be a problem and you could. Those are business contexts that are very well known. But now let's think about governments, right? Governments, in many ways, became the ultimate issuer of identity or identity certificates. Even in the old world, the paper-based world of driver's licenses and passports. because in many ways, having a vote, having a say in government was a service that was built. But then over time, as that network grows, then there's lots of people that try to exploit that information asymmetry and that network of trust by mining people's identities or using. So this is a problem that is inherent in businesses overall, and this is one of the problems that this whole Web 3.0, we keep trying to emulate the models of Web 2.0 and building the biggest network, the most users possible, the most simple standard in a very centralized way. But that in many times ends up defeating the purpose again, because you're gonna, if it's a company building identity software, if it's not open sourced, or if the profit motive isn't necessarily, in it, all they're really trying to do from a business, even though we all have ideals, me the same, about our protocol or our system being able to spread through the whole world. The problem is we still then want to. We start thinking about a business platform where we become a platform, right? Our power by distributing it through the whole world is now to figure out how to monetize that distribution, right? So we keep running into these problems, whether it's in the government context or it's in the business context, where the biggest networks with the most centralization can provide the most convenience in many ways, until it doesn't, right? Until it switches, and that convenience is then used against you, right? So this is a problem that I keep trying to think about overall. Like, how do we change the design philosophy to think of a different business model rather than trying to mine trust? And if we can get away from that, where we can actually create business models that assume people don't trust each other, that may be a way forward. I don't know if that helps at all.
Well, I think this is actually what you're trying to do, and what you're doing by coming with this other angle of energy, which is this kind of, which is also kind of which is a service, which is something that's regulated also in a different way, but that's also, and so coming from that angle, you're able to frame the question a little bit differently, because I fully agree. If we are having this discussion on a theoretical level, it's going to be very difficult to bring it down to the kind of time scale that we have at this moment all over Europe. Identity is being marketed by governments. We see fully commercial players moving into digital identity management space, which is quite logical, it's quite real. We got nothing against that, but it needs to be debated, and the time frame of debating these issues is very, very small. We have huge issues with self-sovereign identity, but we need to be able to portray them all in a particular way and show the trajectories of how this will play out towards our democracies, and that's a very very serious question. So maybe I would like to go to the question of Loretta and go to you, Joshua. Loretta is asking, and Loretta Anania, she's with the European Commission, and she's actually the PO of our project. So, and she's asking, are interoperability standards necessary for digital identity to evolve away from Facebook-type monopoly identity networks of today? I think this touches very much also upon what you're trying to do with the education, with the courses, and with DLT courses, and sort of trying to find a way to have people understand this at a very high level, policy level. Sort of.
Yeah. So when it comes to standards, what really is a standard? Is a standard what an authority says we should use, or is it what the community uses? And I think in various spaces we have seen de facto standards emerge as the ultimate interface that we use between systems. And the big question is, who will drive the standard? Will it be an authority? Will it be the EU who says you have to use our standard? Or will it be an ad hoc provider who all platforms out there just start to use? So is a standard necessary? Yes, I think it's definitely necessary to have not necessarily a strict standard, but some sort of interface between different systems. Where that will emerge from, I don't know. I think that's more of a policy issue, whether Europe does want to, or any jurisdiction does want to propose a standard, but I think that may go against many types of systems. And I think like there are a few questions here talking about the technology, like what's doable. The technology, we can achieve mostly everything. It's not the issue. I think the issues are more policy related issues, and we have to think about how societies interact. I mean, at the end of the day, we are living in a society, and we cannot just decide amongst ourselves, if we are a subset of that society, how we want to live. So if we're thinking about the driving license, and a group of people say, you know what, we will be a decentralized driving authority and issue licenses to people, and these people can't drive, and they start killing people. So we cannot just choose to decentralize everything. I think we need to start thinking about what should we decentralize, what we definitely need to keep centralized, and also stop thinking in the extremes, because when we say that we can decentralize identity and perhaps have disposable identities, that's brilliant for certain use cases, but it's probably not good for some use cases. So we might need some sort of hierarchy of different types of identities, and that's the main issue. It's not a technical issue, it's a social issue. How are we going to structure this?
I'd like to, in some ways, disagree with you. I sort of agree and disagree, if I may. Maybe just kick the discussion into a different direction. Because I still see here that where you're talking about the driving license, I don't see the driving license as a form of identity. It's actually a sort of context-related form of verified status. And so,
if I may just clarify the point. So irrespective of where you got the identity from, the driving authority has given you the right to drive in that country.
yes,
Now,
yes.
what I'm trying to say is that you have some identity, and a group of decentralized people have given you that right.
Mm-hmm. But then yeah, okay. But then the discussion about whether that's centralized or decentralized, for me, that's irrelevant, because what you're talking about is, I think, is another facet, which is the validation, verification, or certification. And that's where it comes
but it's the same thing, right? When we're talking about decentralized identities and the various services and stamp of approval, whether they're authoritative or not. It could be it could be a group of people talking about driving licenses. It could be a person talking about receiving an educational certificate. It could be anything.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that actually, this also brings in a wonderful sort of slightly mind-twisting discussion we had when we in decentralized, centralized, where we also realized the disposable identities that we're working on is that we're actually shifting it, because suddenly one of the UXers says, but aren't we just creating another centralized system that's actually managed by the user? So you're centralizing, which is the self-sovereign identity, of course. We're just shifting it from one to the other. So that's why I think I kind of argue against your saying that decentralized or centralized driving agency. I don't see that as an issue, because ultimately it's the centralization where one body has all of my data is what I don't want, where they can actually make those connections, make those assumptions, make those profiles, and in some ways develop certain forms of control. So I don't see that as a problem at all.
But isn't it the case that we need to apply the data to that identity? If it's only a system where you can read data, then it's a bit useless. Yeah. And it's the connection to the legal world that...
I think sort of what we are discussing, I think it stresses the importance of the work of the W3C on verifiable claims and verifiable and credentials, where this type of thinking is sort of happening, where we take identity no longer to this level of, let's say, the person, but the person has all these credentials, and we'll just focus on the layer of the credentials. We'll make sure that from these credentials, it's very difficult or impossible or cryptographically only time limited, purpose limited, to go to the person only with these GDPR sort of constraints.
Yes.
And that's the kind of wave, I think, that we see happening all across, where this essence, the notion of this essence, is sort of being sort of let loose a little bit, and we're going more towards these defining identities, context specific, taking certain properties. And I think this is happening sort of consecutively with persons and also with goods, where we see AI coming along and sort of creating more event types of not having sort of these kind of fixed identities, but more dynamic. So I think the whole discussion sort of evolves around here, and maybe we will end up with a distributed kind of system, or the word distributed will become more important than central or decentral. But this is the discussion that we should have, that we're having now, and then we will keep this discussion going. So thanks very much.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing I want to say, this driver's license debate is actually incredibly important as we think about identity. In that I actually agree, it's not an identity. It's a form of credential that we've used as identity. And so the big question is, why is it that we use that as identity, right? Why did the driver's license become a form of identity? And in my view, it's the carrots and sticks of this credential issuing. And if you think about it, why did that become a very trusted form of identity? Because if you lied about it, if you cheated about it, the consequences were quite great, right? Guys with guns would come and lock you up, or you would have to pay a very big fine to a court because you falsified that credential. So it actually isn't our identity. It's an issuing credential, but the consequences of defrauding that credential were extreme. And that's where we need to think about, in my view, these distributed or decentralized systems. We need to think about federated identity. At the end of the day, I want to control my identity, and I always will control my identity. And my identity is probably different in my public Twitter profile to my private internal, employee calls, to my Instagram profile, to I control a different form of my public facing identity in different realms. So what's really at stake is thinking about new systems of credentialing rather than necessarily identity. And I think that's what the real promise of this technology is that we can really federate identity rather than centralizing it by the issuer. So anyways, continue.
I'm so glad you said that, actually. I mean, that's really, I think, really hit the nail on the head. And I'd like to add another layer to that. And this is, I think, connecting also to maybe the policy and regulatory aspects, is by having this these credentials connected with the identity, what we're ultimately looking towards is access or non-access. And actually, these were the discussions that popped up in the early scenarios that we were doing back in March for the Corona app solutions. And there were lots of different ways that technology, I think it was wonderful that people were coming together to try and come up with solutions to help solve the current situation. But what we realized very quickly from the UX perspective is what we are doing is creating the potential tools to exclude people. And that's a very, very dangerous route to go down. And I think it's wonderful that we picked up on the driving license. That actually gives access to be able to drive, access to have insurance, access to a bunch of services and abilities because you've earned them. But what if we introduce another system whereby that's actually controlled elsewhere? And this is the whole discussion about we have to be very careful on this identity, credential, access, ultimate access result. And that's, I think, one of the discussions that we haven't got the answer. We actually dumped all of the Corona solution scenarios we first developed because we realized that they created more of an issue and a problem than they actually would solve.
Yeah, I completely agree on that. I think one of the main issues that we need to start thinking about is which authority are we going to use to provide certain credentials. I mean, if we talk about educational certificates, for example, and you get a certificate from decentralized university, call it whatever. Will the real world, will an employer out there say, you know what, I trust that? Or do we still have an issue where we need to see a trusted institution? When you come with that certificate from Oxford, they're going to trust you blindly. And I think it's the same case with, again, the driving license, that we need certain authorities who are issuing identities that certain other institutions will trust. So I think besides the enforcement that Josh said, there's also the issue of we do trust our government. Certain people do. I mean, I have some friends who say, and this is obviously anecdotal, I have some friends who say they'd rather trust the government, and I have some friends they'd rather give all their data to Google because they don't trust our government. And I don't think we're ever going to have a silver bullet. And then this raises the next question. Just because we want a decentralized, let's say, authority or whatever, is that the right thing? So does democracy get to define the direction, or should it be the proper policy? Because we don't want everyone voting on perhaps issues that they're not well informed on.
So one, playing on the ID, the driver's license again for 1 second. One of the concepts that we have when we think about educating our system of digital identity is the concept we call the digital bouncer. right? So, and it's all about trust and access. What are you gonna show to the digital bouncer to get through to the service or what you're looking for? And so I go back to that real world use case of you go to a club or you go somewhere and you forgot your identity, right? You forgot your driver's license, not your identity. You have your identity. You forgot your credential, and you try to get through the digital bouncer. How are you going to do that, right? And in the old world, what you did is you said, oh, well, here's my gym membership. And hey, look, this guy's a lawyer. He's dressed nice. He can vouch for me. Hey, I'm going to call the club owner, right? So in the digital context, we want to do all of that same thing in real time, right? We want to get past that bouncer by bringing all of the different verifications that we're credible and we can get into that service. So I don't think that the world going forward should be about big centralized bouncers, right? I think the world is depending on the level of access and what kind of liability you're giving up, right? In a bar, the liability is, someone underage starts drinking, and again, you pay a big fine. There's consequences for falsifying identity. So I think if you have that framework about having digital bouncers for every service, or whether it's a government service or a private service, I think it's an important way to think about identity rather than trusting big government, rather than trusting big Facebook. And at the end of the day, unless we have one big government globally, there's always going to be federated identity through different sovereign jurisdictions. So the digital bouncer concept is what we've focused on.
I completely agree.
I like that too. It has a good narrativity in it. We need this kind of visual imaginaries and narrative concepts, definitely, yes.
Well, I mean, the thing that strikes...
One thing to people in the chat that put things in the chat, we will not be able to look at all the questions now, but we will look at them later. So it'll be in a report and they will be addressed. So thanks all for putting things in, and there'll be a report and we will all send you this. So, okay, yes, Lorna?
Yeah, I just wanted to sort of come back on the digital bouncer thing. To be honest, I hope you don't find me rude, but I think that's an awful term because, again, it has a kind of feeling of power and control, but I get where you're coming from. But interestingly, in these discussions, what I think we're maybe missing is that the issuer of the driving license has their own identity as well. And what we're talking about is one identity talking to another. And are those identities trusted and verified? And how that happens, that's a very interesting mechanism that I don't think we have all of the answers to. A government organization that has an identity, is a government one identity or is it multiple identities? And I think particularly in healthcare world, that's a very, very interesting question, because we see now in different countries, they have different systems, whether it's centralized or decentralized. But when you actually go as an individual into a hospital, do they have access to your other health identity, which is your doctor, or maybe another health identity, which is your app, which you're storing information in? And so I think we need to maybe mindset-wise stop thinking of the other organization's app as being something different to also an entity with an identity. I think it makes it a lot simpler.
Yes, I think we're nearing sort of the end of this hour. I think we have all of the feeling that we could go on and on, which is great, because it shows that this is a timely topic and that these things are happening and dynamic. And we will continue this conversation in further webinars that we will have in August and September, but and also in other forms of conversation. But so to close, I would like to ask all of you, if I ask you what is it that you lack most at this moment? Sort of what would, that's kind of the question that I would like to ask all three, and then I would like to ask Mantalena to close the session, if that's okay.
So I would say, and it's quite clear from this discussion, that we don't have an idea of what should be centralized and what should be decentralized. And certain people are pushing the agenda at both extremes. And I think that is the big question. We need to start really considering, what do we really need to decentralize? Do we really need to decentralize our driving authority? So I think that's what we need to start considering.
Thank you. Yes, Lorna?
Yeah, for me, it goes much further than centralized or decentralized. It's much more about the challenge of really getting into a new paradigm of understanding a new paradigm of language. As you see, I mean, we've spent months of getting mixed up with, you know, identity data, context, credentials, verifiable, and bringing that into the regular human world is a huge, huge challenge. And the only way we're going to do that is, I think, shifting the balance and the actions and even maybe the funding a little bit more towards really expert user experience development, building it, trying it and seeing, because we will all the time, we will be surprised and in some cases disappointed, some cases excited about how the user's mental model evolves in this whole discussion. So it's not about decentralized, centralized, it's actually about making this real in people's lives. Huge challenge.
Absolutely, and as you say, I just want to, I mean, I don't have to stress this because people understand, but it's so incredibly important now because we've missed out on that so much, and all the people that are very successful now have hit on this UX so early. Like that's what we've been talking with together. So this time we need to really have the whole thinking, the whole design practice, the whole testing, the whole iterations running together, and not having them separated that somehow as let's do this like let's sort of, okay, at the end we're going to do this or that. No, it has to be tight from the beginning. So Josh, maybe your last words on what you're sort of would say.
Yeah, my last word, you know, sort of my last words, and sort of throw a bomb in the end of the conversation. You know, for me, I think it really is thinking at a much bigger level of what we're trying to solve for. Right? I agree that the technical tools are there, but what are we trying to solve for? From a business perspective, again, if the question is, we're trying to create the new platform, we're trying to create the new monopoly, we're going to try the new standards so we can benefit from it. That, to me, is not what we should be trying to solve for. If it's a government, I'm trying to optimize taxes, I'm trying to optimize data and control. That's not what we want to solve for. Ultimately, we want to be solving for, and again, here's the bomb. I think we want to be trying to solve for, how do we minimize violence, right? And I think if you look at the history of identity and where identity came into governments, really, again, at the end of the day, why are governments most trusted with identity? Because they have a monopoly on the violence to enforce if you lied about it, right? And so in a business context, your violence is probably, you know, a fine or a penalty, but if you're locked up or something else, right? So I think if we think about identity around trying to minimize violence, it's a very different thing. It's a very different subject than what I'm doing in the business world. But I think it's a very important discussion that the technology is there. But what are we really trying to solve for? And what is the main question people need to be asking when they're building new systems?
I think this is it's very important that you bring this up, because this allows us to turn in, let's say, the political without turning in the political. It's because of the way that you frame this. And just very quickly, so this is very important in the context of the whole sphere in which we're in now. For example, if we look at the social credit system in China at the moment and the way this is happening, we also have to understand that the person registration in China started in 278 BC with the first emperor. And in Europe, it started 2,000 years later in the 1800s with Napoleon. So these things this type of historical understanding is important in trying to shift these paradigms as well. So thank you very much for bringing that up. So Mantalena, would you like to close the session? And thank you very much.
Sure. What a privilege to catch the bomb that Josh just dropped. I would go for the word violence, and I would connect it with a thing that I've been thinking during your discussion. So interesting, all these points that you made. We indeed, I would say that the pandemic days, the pandemic conditions revealed some really surprising points about our lives, about the human behavior. And Lorna, indeed, we need to explore the new language to communicate these issues. And one of the initial objectives of ELONTech was how to redefine basic, fundamental terms of justice, of law, on on a digital environment. While now we come to a point that we really need to come up with new concepts to define what is happening, not to redefine, but to define what is happening and give a name to what is happening. And it takes a lot of courage. And I will go back to this circle I will circle it and go to the violence word, because I was thinking that it is like watching who protects the sheep if the dog becomes a wolf, and would one day the sheep really want the wolf to take over, because the threat out there is such bigger that they would really consent to that. And all these are really come to existential questions. And indeed, companies are really daring. Technology is developing and progressing. Citizens create initiatives and communities and take steps forward. What the biggest lack here is what we miss is daring policymakers, decision makers, and I think this gives a different value to the fora that we try to create, like this one here today, and the series of the discussions that we want to continue to end up to points and thoughts that we could share with decision makers, so that we can make them understand that there are people out there who do the homework for them, and they can just take the step forward, and they will have all the public support. These are challenging times, and we do need to start from the fundamental issue of naming what is the main challenge. And I do wonder, do we have the full information, the full overview of the situation to decide where to position ourselves? So with these thoughts, I would like to thank you all for joining us. It was such an incredible discussion, and we are already 1 hour and 3 minutes online, and I wish we could have more time to go, but let's keep this going. We have so many questions. This is happening the first time on this platform. I need to tell you, we hosted quite a few online events here, but this is the first time that the chat is so hot. So we will take all these notes down, and we will have you again back. If not late of August, we wish you can have some vacation by then. Then with the first next opportunity that you are available, we will have you to give your answers to these questions and thoughts that our audience shared with us, our participants. Thank you all. Rob, thank you for this. Thank you for your moderation, and we'll see you soon again. Have a lovely August.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mantalena. Thank you. Great to meet you, Joshua and Josh.
Thank you, Joshua and Rob.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks all. It was great. Thank you.
Likewise.